It is your weekly Big 12 roundtable this week. Still no Steven Simcox. He is in Mickey World. He is with the family in Disney World. I am Josh Neighbors, the host of Locked On Big 12. John Williams is here. He is the host of Locked On Sooners, as is Linda Godfrey. She is the host of Locked On Pokes, and also Jake Hatch. He is the host of Locked On Cougars. Tonight, we have a lot of news. We got Mark Emmert. He is going to be stepping down as the head of the NCAA. Then we have some news about the Baylor quarterback situation. Sounds like we know who it's going to be at the helm, at least to start the season next year for the Baylor Bears. And then take a look back at some spring football, maybe a little NFL draft in there as well. A lot to talk about today on the show coming up after this.
Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, once again, so the big news today, folks, was that Mark Emmert, the one of the great punching bags in American sports. We've talked about this before, but commissioners, usually in professional sports, are very much punching bags. Like that is kind of their function. Roger Goodell is a great example. Anytime anybody's mad at the league, they're like, Roger freaking Goodell. We're so mad at him. And usually, here's the thing. He takes it, he eats it, he wears it well, whatever he has to do. He makes a lot of money. And guess what happens? It's the most watched sport in the entire country, right? And that's why he is paid so handsomely. Mark Emmert is really the opposite end of this. To me, guys, I want to start like this. I don't think we know what Mark Emmert's legacy is going to be because he has left the door so wide open for so much to change. So closing the book on this now, and I think they said that he is going to serve until June 30th, 2023, but I think, also at the same time, like if they really find somebody before then, I don't see him staying on, whatever. Kind of almost a Bob Bowlesby situation, right? In that kind of sense. I think that's probably how it would go down. We'll see. But do you guys agree with my assessment? John, I'll go to you first, that like we can't close the book yet on Mark Emmert because the door is wide open for a lot of things to happen, whether it be NIL, transfer portal, and college football, and really the NCAA's involvement in college football moving forward.
Yeah, there was not really much done at the NCAA level to enact regulations for NIL to kind of restrict the transfer portal. They kind of just let it be the wild, wild west and kind of did the Pontius Pilate. We're washing our hands of this and good luck, everybody. And I kind of think what you're hearing from coaches across the country, the Sabins, Lincoln Riley at times, Dabo Sweeney is a big proponent of regulation and creating some structure to this. A lot of that is probably some frustration with the NCAA leadership and not providing an avenue to have some regulation, not stepping in and saying, hey, look, we're going to be the leaders on this. We're going to be the ones not relying on the states to create what this should look like, not relying on the universities to create what this should look like. We're going to be the ones to be proactive, setting up some guidelines, setting up some restrictions, so that it does have some transparency and does have some cleanliness to it. Because for better or worse, I mean, we're seeing the pay for player thing happening. It's not strictly that, but it is what it is. But that's partly the NCAA's fault for not creating a sense of boundaries for these schools to work within and the businesses to work within as well, to make sure that it's staying on the up and up. And I think just the inactivity of Mark Emmert in that vein is part of what's going to be the lasting memory of him as far as NIL is concerned. I think it's what you said. The commissioner is there to be the go-between between the fans and the ownership. In this case, the fans and the presidents of the university. I mean, the NCAA, he got a lot of power because of the conferences and the presidents of those conferences, but they needed a better leader in this last 12 years. I mean, so much realignment's gone down. We've seen, the college football playoff expand. It could have expanded further, but it didn't. We've seen transfer portal just open up and NIL just kind of become the wild, wild west. And so I mean, the NCAA, if they really want to be an active part of college football, which they seem to want to be, then they need to take a lead on some of these things that have become pretty controversial over the last couple of years.
So, Linda, if you had to pick a favorite or least favorite, well, if you're picking the least favorite, I guess it would be the NCAA punishing Oklahoma State. So that's probably the least favorite. But if you had to pick like your favorite adventure that we've had during the 12-year tenure of Mark Emmert, I'll give you the chance of talking about them fighting against NIL, obviously. I'll give you the chance to talk about them, with the inequity of the women's basketball tournament when they've got plenty of money to support it. We know how much their men's tournament makes, and the inequities that we saw on that front. The pay for play in basketball, which really the NCAA didn't seem too keen on punishing anybody for a long time. We're still waiting to hear what Kansas's rule is going to be. But hey, look, I'm wearing my Missouri shirt. You're an Oklahoma State fan. We get to hear pretty fast about our overbearing punishments for us. So choose your own adventure. What's been your favorite of the Mark Emmert tenure?
Man, my heart's beating all fast. I love a good choose your own adventure. First of all, it feels like things started happening, especially recently with like the NIL, and he just like, that move where you put your finger in your ear and you go like, nah, like
Yeah.
I'm out, I'm done. And he's just kind of gonna wash his hands of the mess that he's made, which is a special kind of human. Just as a whole, it's a character flaw in my opinion. But for sure, the way that he's handled the NCAA women's basketball tournament held this year was the first year that they got to brand as March Madness.
Mm-hmm.
That's insane. And what happened? They put those games on TV and people watched them. People went to the games, they went to the stadiums. And yes, it helped that there was some attention on some of those girls that were playing really well. I mean, I was seeing them on TikTok, you were seeing them on Twitter. There was like hype surrounding it because they put some money into it, which is wild how that happens. I like the transfer portal. There's certainly things that I like in the advancement. I would like to see
just not regulated well, right? Like there's no windows for transfer
there
portal.
are issues.
There's no rules on what constitute name, image, likeness deals.
Yeah,
Or we just handed
I
kids
agree.
cash.
It's not, none of it's perfect. But again, anytime
Right.
you present a problem to him, he like I'm not listening to you. I don't care about, like, it just feels like he was super unattentive. And when you're talking about a guy that's in charge of as much as you're in charge of, I'd much rather have someone that's very attentive than a guy that just seems to not care too much.
Jake, it was the constant, the one thing that was consistent from Mark Emmert during his tenure was the amateurism, right? It was always student athlete. These are amateurs. And during the 2010s, I think especially in that tenure, the money was skyrocketing for television contracts, for these bowl games, like, like the title sponsors, the NCAA tournament. They were always making a lot of money off that, but I think there was more attention paid to how much money was made off those events. In this span, I think we had the moment of Shabazz Napier talking about going to bed hungry, right? Not, remember the unlimited meal plan that came along finally that wasn't a thing until Shabazz Napier had said something. And they finally did it. And then, talk about that and like the awful food accommodations the female players had last year during the, and the men were eating great. But the one constant through every controversy and everything has been the student athlete amateurism. Is that the problem? Is it just like the NCAA's reluctance to be like, we can't let go of amateurism? Is that what's going to kill Mark Emmert in the end and the entire NCAA?
I do think that's going to be absolutely one of those things that's going to obviously taint his legacy, because you're right. It was just a constant refrain. Well, we're doing this for the student athletes. We're doing this for the student athletes. You know what? You can stop it with the Pharisaical saying that it's the student athletes. You guys are a multi-billion-dollar business that doesn't want to lose any of that money. You guys can remember in the early days of that pandemic, the NCAA fought tooth and nail to keep the NCAA tournament alive because they were not about to give up that billion-dollar tournament. Mm-hmm. And they finally had their hand forced when everybody else around them was canceling. So it's one of those things. I wish the NCAA would just have realized, you know what? We're a multi-billion-dollar sports entity. We should stop acting like we're this mom and pop shop, because you're not that. Just give up the gig.
but they're a nonprofit.
They're acting like my daughter's, local soccer league.
Yeah,
like,
sure.
hey,
Yes.
we need
some
your
sponsors
money.
in the back here.
Yeah, hey, actually, you're gonna have to buy your own shirts.
Right.
And if you need equipment, you better go get those at the Dick's Sporting Goods down the road. Like, we're not gonna provide you anything. It's absolutely ludicrous.
I think John Oliver did a great job a few years ago when he did, your mileage might vary on John Oliver, but just talking about the NCAA tournament and like exposing really, if you want to deep dive at like a lot of the business numbers in actually a pretty shortened period of time, John Oliver does a great job with that. But this kind of leads us to the idea of like there is no situation where somebody comes in and turns this thing around, in my opinion. Like, this ship has sailed. College football is going to be run by the conferences and conference commissioners. Now, my question is, the only thing I think the NCAA gets involved with at that point is going to be eligibility. And I mean, I don't even know if name, image, likeness is going to have it. But if it's just an eligibility thing, I mean, even at that point, you might see a separation. So, John, I'll go to you on this. Like, I think they're going to be okay with the basketball side of things, but the college football ship's going to sail because the NCAA hasn't done anything recently. And it showed that, like, look, the sport will persist. Yes, we need parameters and guidelines, but we're not going to trust this clown car of individuals to set them.
Well, there's going to come a point in time when the Power 5 conferences in particular kind of become self-aware and realize they don't need the NCAA as a governing body, that those 5 conference commissioners, and if they want to bring in the group of 5 with them, they can create their own league separate. They can hire an independent individual to oversee the whole thing, much like the NFL does with Roger Goodell. They can bring somebody in, or they can bring in their own group of people and hire their own group of people, because there's going to be plenty of money wherever college football goes. The money's going to follow. They could have their own, NCAA like board of people to oversee college football playoff, oversee, the conference structure, oversee scheduling, oversee the eligibility. I mean, the NCAA is really not necessary in college football. You got enough power brokers in the conferences, in the college football playoff committee, that could create their own league. I mean, we've heard whispers of that over the last, few weeks, that by the 2030s that we're going to see a big college football league separate from the NCAA. And I mean, I don't hate it. I don't hate the idea of it, but what you need is some strong leadership to take that over. You're going to need somebody that's got the chops to run a professional sports league ×2, because I mean, if you're talking about taking all 5 power conferences, you're talking about more than 50 teams. That's way more than what an NFL commissioner oversees, the Major League Baseball commissioner oversees. And so you're going to need a strong group of people to oversee whatever the future of college football looks like if it is separate from the NCAA, because that looks to be the way it's heading. And if they don't create that strong leadership, then we're going to see this conference realignment thing constantly reoccurring, and this wishy-washy move on college football playoff where it would have benefited every single conference, but several conferences were like, nah, we're good. We're going to just leave the money on the table for the next 5-10 years, and then we'll get the money later. But if you'd have had strong leadership that was going to the commissioners and saying, listen, this is going to put this amount of money in your back pocket if we do this now, they would have been like, yeah, okay, sure, let's do it. But right. Politics got involved, and the alliance, we've talked about it before on the show, but the alliance kind of decided they were going to have their way with it. But again, if college football is heading away from the NCAA, the conferences really need to find a good, strong, independent voice to be the figurehead and the leader of whatever that organization looks like, and then a body of people that works under that person to really make sure that college football is heading in a good trajectory.
Linda, for the other sports, for basketball, both men's and women's, and baseball, and softball, and track and field, and soccer, they still depend on the NCAA to set up and run these events and these championships. And I know my question is, like, does the NCAA just need the world's best event planner to be the new head of the NCAA? Like, is that what this needs? Because I'll tell you this, I mean, the College World Series is a spectacular event. The Women's College World Series is dynamite of an event. I thought this year the women's college basketball, the NCAA tournament, had some better games than the men's did. I thought that UConn NC State game was the best tournament game I saw, irrespective of men's or women's. And I think there's not going to be a change of who is in charge of those events. So, like, I think the NCAA still has utility. It's just gonna be weird. I think the one thing I'm thinking about when your thoughts on this, Linda, is like, is it gonna be weird that we're gonna have one organization, like John said, working on the football, and then everything else is gonna be under the NCAA? Or do you think at some point there's other branching off for things like basketball?
I would wager that the NCAA always exists in some capacity for all of college sports. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't get somebody at the helm that then delegates an entire system or branch that is in charge of football, like that's it. And then everybody else focuses on something else. But I would wager that the NCAA always has at least like a pinky toe in the pool of college football from some kind of angle. But you have to get somebody that can delegate, and yes, event plan. That, I think that's huge. We talked about it when we talked about who's going to take over as the Big 12 commissioner. Somebody that can communicate with crowds of young people. Like, that's your goal. You're trying to get new faces into a sport that they may not know about or be in, like, when they're playing golf on TV, or like you said, softball. The softball tournament is seriously so much fun. I'm not a softball player. I went to like one practice as a kid. After 4 minutes, I was like, this is not for me. But watching it is a thrill. I watch it with my daughter. We have a blast. So, like, you have to get somebody in that's going to spread the awareness about all these other sports. And that's going to be somebody that's a good event planner and maybe a little more youthful. But I think the NCAA taking their hands off of football a little bit is okay. I just think that there's a pretty good chance they always have just an inkling to do with it.
Jake, your thoughts
Does
on
that
that?
answer your question?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I know. I mean, I don't know if, I mean, Jake, do you think the NCAA is going to have any tie to college football? Like, is the eligibility thing going to be there, or like, are they just going to be like, all right, will SEC and Greg Sankey and all those guys be like, you know what, we'll make our own eligibility rules, somewhat close to what's going on there, but like,
it goes back to, I don't know how many of you guys, I think all you read this, was the interview in Sports Illustrated from Jack Swarbrick from Notre Dame, the AD at Notre Dame, saying that he believes there's a breakup of the NCAA. It's inevitable. That's the quote he uses. It was inevitable. Right. And he thinks middle 2030s is when it would come down. He said there'll be schools that will still tie their athletics to the academic thing. And then he also thinks there are going to be schools that will essentially license their intellectual property for their athletics programs to another entity, but they will still retain the name. So an example, BYU could lease it out to some X entity out there that would essentially operate as BYU's athletic department, for example. And it would happen for any one of those. It'd be very interesting to see how they do navigate this, because whoever takes over, they're already fighting an uphill battle, because the perception, yes, they're the most hated person in sports, it feels like, in many ways, the second they take that job. To go back real quick on the Women's College World Series thing, my wife has played in the Women's College World Series. She's a softball player at Division I level. That tournament is absolutely incredible. We still watch it to this day, me and her, and it's so much fun. So that's the type of stuff that should be highlighted more. I know football drives things, men's and women's basketball in particular really drives it, but these other sports and their postseasons, because you're right, the World Series for both the baseball and softball thing, that's a lot of fun, and that should be highlighted more, I feel like, moving forward. The question will be, who can you find that can balance both continuing to push the football element while also understanding that, hey, we've got to pay attention to these other sports, because at some point that football side of things may ultimately just divorce itself from us completely.
Yeah, the question to me is, I think their ace in the hole right now for the NCAA is that they're holding on to what is a nearly $1 billion event every year in the NCAA tournament, right? So, and I think their television contract is running through like 2032, I think is what it is right now. I'm looking at it right now. Yeah, the deal to 2032. Yeah. So, they have, and that's always going to draw. Like, there's no situation where it's bulletproof, right? It is, the NCAA tournament is absolutely bulletproof. There's no situation unless they started, doing something awful to make it not appealing to everybody. But that's my question. I know Jack Swarbrick is saying like, yeah, it'll all break up, but I'm not an expert on these things. Does anybody have any idea how like the NCAA would lose the NCAA tournament, which is what it's known as? It's NCAA March Madness. NCAA. I don't see a situation where that happens. Jake,
the way I took it from Swarbrick is he's thinking more football than anything else.
right?
Will break things up, because I'm with you. The NCAA, that cash cow, there is not a chance in hell that they are going to let go of that. They are not letting go of that bag at all. So maybe it is that football ultimately does decide it's going to become its own singular entity, and maybe has a loose association with the NCAA and its member schools because they're playing in the sport. But maybe at that point, there is just a complete separation essentially of football, and then all these other sports over here are still under the NCAA umbrella. Maybe that's how they will go about it.